We're going to begin by threading. Now I actually have a spool of thread behind my machine. I'm using a cone thread, so you're not going to see it up here, but normally you would put your thread up on one of the spindles on the top. There are several different guides when you go to actually thread your machine. But what you always want to remember, and all machines do this, is you're basically drawing a backwards N. So you're coming from the top right, you're coming down, you're going up, and you're coming back down. So you're basically, it's like a capital N, but you're going backwards. So that's the direction that you're going to be taking your thread. So I've gone ahead and I've got it under the first guide. Now you're going to have a tension plate right here. And this is actually where you can control the tension on your machine when you have a heavier fabric or a lighter fabric. And you'll just have to play around with this as you're learning how to sew. We're going to put it through the blade, so there's actually like a little lip here. So it kind of shows you that you're going to put your thread right in front of that. As you can see, I'm actually holding my thread right above. This way I can kind of keep pressure on it. I'm going to come up and see there's a little, what I like to call, looks like a paper clip. It's going to move up and down. I'm actually going to swing my arm back over this way. So it's like I'm going to come all the way over, but then I come right back. And I don't know if you can see, but it does actually loop on the tension plate itself. Okay, now there's actually another little guide here. Not all machines have the same guides. This one has one right here. From at this point, so we've gone from the top right, we've gone the first part down, now we're going to go up to the left. Now we have the thread take up lever. So as you can see, you turn your wheel and it will go up and down. And we probably want to make sure it's up at its highest point in order to get the thread in there. This one's nice and easy because it actually has a little hook in here. Some of them you will actually just have to thread directly through. This one's nice because I don't have to do that, so it has to go through here. It's basically like, look at this as like the eye. So it has to go through the eye, then it comes back down, and there's actually another little guide here. And because this thread's kind of going through, I'm just going to throw both of those into that guide. We have another little guide right here. And then there's sometimes a guide right in front of the needle. So here you can kind of flip it right here. Most of them will just be kind of a slide action, and then you're going to be threading from front to back. There are some machines you will be threading that side to side, and you'll basically be starting on your left side and you're going to be threading it to the right. Okay, so we have just threaded the machine. We actually need to have a bobbin. So on this one, well, I've gone ahead and wound the bobbin. Basically, you would need to take this out, and this place up here is where my bobbin would go, and you flip it over and it'll actually catch kind of against here. This one needs a little bit of loosening because this one just likes to go all the way across. But once you trigger this action, this is getting pushed, the part underneath is getting pushed up against the wheel. So as the power goes, it's actually going to be threading, it's going to be winding this, and it's going to be going around in a circle. So you can kind of see it's going. I don't want to do it too much. Other things to know on your machine, you usually will have reverse somewhere on your machine. This one goes down. I've had some that you kind of push in. There's a whole bunch of different functions, and we use the back stitch when we're actually beginning and ending a stitch, sometimes even in the middle. You're going to have a stitch length and you're going to have a stitch width, and that will vary on your machine. The stitch length tells you how big the stitch is going to be. So if it's going to be a basting stitch, the stitch length is going to tell you that. The stitch width tells you how wide a zigzag would be. For this one, we're going to keep it straight. I know you can't see the settings on here, but we're going to keep it straight. And this one has settings for the length between 6 and 12. And then there's another setting that says 0. Sometimes it'll even say 24. It's usually an extreme number that's not close to what the other numbers are. And that is usually used for a buttonhole or a really, really tiny stitch. We're not going to use that. We have from 6 to 12. Some of these machines will have from 1 to 5. And this one, so a regular stitch is going to be around 10 that we're going to use on this machine. So that's a relatively middle of the size, closer to being a small stitch. When you're going to be working on a machine that has from 1 to 5, you're going to be sewing at about a 2.5, maybe a 2. You don't want your stitch to be too tiny, so you want to test it on your machine. I have one machine that actually the stitch is very, very tiny for a 3, so we actually have to do it at 3.5 on that machine. So it really kind of depends. So we have our bobbin. We're going to pretend we already ran that, and because every machine's a little bit different with the bobbin winding, so there's really no sense in me showing you how to do it on this particular machine. Now there's 2 different ways that a bobbin is actually set into the machine. One is using a bobbin case. This one, as you can see, this one sets in and the other one sits down. So the bobbin case on the ones that go down are usually in Singer sewing machines, and the case is actually built into the machine. This has a separate case. So I'm going to have it here. I'm going to have my thread, so the thread is hanging over the left side. You can see that. And I'm going to slide that and pop that right in. With my finger holding it, I'm going to move my thread around, and there's actually a little kind of notch in here. And I'm going to just pull my thread, and it's actually going to slide. So this is a tension plate here. We actually have to have tension on the top, and we also have to have tension on the bottom. So this plate right here and this little screw controls the tension on it. So when you pull this, there should be some tension. And this one actually feels a little bit tight, but I've tested this machine and it's fine. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, it's actually really easy to drop this out of place. So I'm going to kind of keep my finger holding and kind of keep it tilted back. And as you can see, this big hole right here, that's actually where the needle is going to go down and catch the thread from here. So we need to make sure that it doesn't go in sideways, because if it goes in sideways, you're going to break the needle. So this part has to be straight up. So I'm going to slide this in. I'm going to keep it tilted, and you're going to hear a click. So I'm going to position it in place, and I'm going to be quiet so you can hear the click. Okay, once you have that click, we're then going to take the needle up. In order for us to get the thread from the bottom to the top, we actually have to have the needle threaded. So I'm going to go ahead and thread my needle. And this one's a kind of a small hole. This one is actually, the size needle is a 70. I was actually working on something where I needed a 70 ballpoint, so that's what I have in here right now. When you're looking at needles, the larger of the number, so let's say you've got a 60, a 70, 80, 90, 100. The 100 is going to be for a very thick fabric, and it's a very thick needle. Your 60 is going to pretty much be the smallest one you can get, unless there's some that I'm not aware of. And that's going to be for your really fine needles. Now, I started doing this without actually explaining what I'm doing, so I'll do it again. I do this without even thinking. I'm holding onto this thread on top very loosely, but I'm holding it so I can actually give it tension if I need to. I'm going to turn the wheel towards me. I'm going to let that needle go all the way down. And when that needle comes back up, I'm going to start pulling this thread, the one that's in my hand, start pulling that. And I don't want my needle to go down again. If your needle goes down again, there's a chance that you could actually end up knotting the thread down below. So now you're going to take a pin or nippers or something, and we're going to pull that thread from the bottom up through there. And then I'm going to put my plate back on, and we are ready to sew. Whenever you're going to test your machine, whenever you're going to sew anything on this, you need to make sure that you're testing it and you're really sewing with 2 layers. The only reason why you would be doing 1 layer is possibly if you're doing a gathering stitch, but most of the time you're going to be sewing a seam, and a seam requires 2 pieces of fabric. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin these together. They're lined up on the edge. Now when I pin it, I like to pin with the heads of the pins coming off the fabric. That way, if you flip it over this way, you can still remove your pins as you're sewing. If you sew them like this, or if you pin it like this, and then you go to sew this way, well, all of a sudden now you can't get to your pin heads. So that's why I always pin off the side, and I always recommend to pin off the side. There are some occasions where I would actually say do it otherwise, but for this part I am not. So I'm just going to put a couple pins in here. A few things we need to know before we actually start stitching is what our seam allowances are. In standard commercial patterns, you have 5/8 of an inch, which is pretty standard. And there is a long line that's usually, I don't know if you can kind of see, I'm trying to keep my arm out of the way. There's a long line here that kind of indicates where my 5/8 is. And if you're not sure, because this one actually has two lines, this one shows me a 1/2 inch and 5/8. You can look over here. Usually on the faceplate you will see numbers. This one actually says 5/8. Sometimes it'll just say 5, 6, 7, 8. This one, it does say 5/8. So I know this line is going to be my standard seam allowance. Now when you're working on industry patterns, so you're working in the industry or you're making your own patterns, it's very common to use 1/2 inch or even smaller. But right now I'm just going to demonstrate with the 5/8. So I'm going to line this up. Now when I get this ready to go through the machine, I actually don't want to start so my fabric's right where the needle is, because you know what's going to happen when you start sewing, the thread doesn't have anything to grab onto, so there's no fabric, so it's going to basically cause a knot and it's not going to feed through the machine. So we want to actually slide it back. So when you're sewing, there is underneath you have these plates, and if you turn the wheel you can kind of see that they move back and forth. Well, this is called the feed dogs. So this actually is what feeds the fabric through the machine. So when you're sewing, you shouldn't have to do anything except guide it through the machine. Your foot and the machine is going to do all the work for you. But you have to make sure that it's gripping it. So the foot has to be holding onto the fabric, which is holding on to the feed dogs. So when I like to start, especially I like to tell beginners, let's line it up so the back of the foot is touching the back of the fabric. Now once you're an experienced sewer, you don't have to do this. This is just until you get used to it. So because we're starting so far in on the garment, I'm immediately going to start by doing my back stitch. So I'm going to push my lever, and now I think some of the newer machines, all you have to do is push a button and it'll back stitch as far as you want. So this is really for the older machines, industrial machines, anyone who has a machine that isn't completely automated. So I'm going to start by back stitching all the way to the end. So I'm going to hold down my reverse and put foot on the pedal and all the way to the end, and then I can actually go forward. So I'm going to basically, you don't really have to do anything. So the fabric is going to go through itself. I see my hands aren't even holding this. See, no hands. And I'm just sewing it. Now you can see that the fabric, sometimes it has a mind of its own, sometimes a friction on the machine. There's always other things that can get in the way. So what I like to say is, until you really understand how much power you have on this machine and how much the machine has power over this, is try and do this with one finger. Barely touch it and use it to guide. Now you want to take your pins out when you get to about this close, and I don't know if you can see how close I am, but basically the needle's not underneath the foot yet, it's just kind of underneath the toes. And that's the two little tips on them. And then I'm just going to use one finger to guide. Now I'm not worried about what's going on down here. I'm not worried about what's here. I'm only worried about what's getting ready to go through my needle. So I'm not going to try and straighten it up to get it straight down here. I'm just going to try and go, take this nice and straight. There we go. And where these two pieces are two different lengths, it doesn't make sense to do a back stitch on this one, so because we probably cut it off. So I'm actually just going to do a back stitch right at this point. And I probably do back stitches longer than most people, but I like to do about 5 stitches. And we have the little lift, so I can take this out. Now, as you can see, it doesn't want to come out. And what is happening is that thread is directly, I don't know if you can see inside the machine, but the thread is directly underneath the bobbin. So it's stuck underneath the bobbin. So you got, let's say, the bobbin right here, and the thread is right here. And so in order to loosen that up, you just turn the wheel a little bit on the side, and it loosens straight up and it pulls aside. Then give yourself a nice little tail, and then clip it.